Mississippi, 1845. Late summer humidity clung to the delta like a suffocating shroud. On a remote cotton plantation several miles outside Natchez, 3 children were born within minutes of each other in a slave cabin at the edge of the property. By dawn, word had already reached the main house. By nightfall, whispers had begun. The plantation ledger recorded them simply as triplets, female, sound health. No names were written beside the entry. The estate belonged to Edwin Harrow, a second-generation planter whose holdings had steadily expanded along the Mississippi River. Harrow was known among neighboring landowners as stern but orderly. His accounts were precise. His discipline was consistent. His plantation, though not unique in its brutality, was considered controlled. Control, in 1845 Mississippi, was everything. The triplets were born to Miriam, a field worker in her early 20s. According to surviving testimony collected years later, Miriam had rarely spoken above a whisper. She worked the cotton rows with mechanical consistency and avoided punishment by staying unnoticed. The pregnancy had not surprised anyone. Enslaved women bore children regularly. Births meant an increase in property. But 3 infants at once unsettled the plantation hierarchy. They were described in early recollections as nearly identical, each with a faint crescent-shaped birthmark beneath the left ear. It was a detail noted by the plantation's overseer, Thomas Bell, who prided himself on recognizing laborers at a glance. The mark, he said, made them easier to tell apart, though he admitted privately that even he often confused them. For the first year, nothing unusual was recorded. Miriam returned to light field work while the infants were tended by older enslaved women. The triplets survived infancy, a rare feat under plantation conditions. Their survival alone drew attention. The first recorded disturbance occurred in the spring of 1848. Overseer Bell reported that 2 of the girls were found outside their assigned quarters well past curfew. They were 3 years old. No one could explain how they had crossed the yard unnoticed. The main house windows faced the direction of the cabins. Dogs were chained near the path. Bell ordered punishment for Miriam, assuming negligence. She insisted the children had been asleep when she lay down. Over the following months, similar incidents were noted. Tools were misplaced and later discovered arranged in deliberate patterns behind the smokehouse. Livestock gates were unlatched during the night. Once, a lantern inside the storage shed was found burning despite being extinguished hours earlier. Each time, blame fell on the enslaved laborers. Each time, quiet murmurs pointed toward the triplets. By 1850, the girls were 5 years old and worked small tasks, collecting kindling, carrying water. Witness accounts from later depositions suggest they moved in near-perfect coordination. When one spoke, the others often remained silent but attentive, watching faces closely. Several enslaved workers later testified that the sisters seemed to communicate without words, responding to each other's gestures before instructions were completed. Planter Harrow dismissed the talk as superstition, but he did order the girls separated during work hours. The separation did not produce the expected calm. In August of that year, a fire broke out in a tobacco curing shed. It was contained quickly, but investigators, local white farmers who arrived to assist, found no obvious cause. No lightning had struck. No pipe embers were discovered. Overseer Bell stated under oath years later that he had seen one of the triplets near the structure earlier that afternoon, though she carried no matches. Miriam denied involvement. The children denied nothing. They simply stared. It was after this incident that Harrow began keeping private notes in a personal journal. Portions of that journal were recovered decades later when the plantation house was dismantled. In an entry dated September 2, 1850, he wrote, "There is something improper in the manner of these girls. They unsettle the order of the quarters." Order had begun to erode. Enslaved workers started refusing to sleep near the cabin where the triplets lived. One elderly woman reportedly claimed the girls stood at the foot of her cot during the night without speaking. Another described hearing 3 sets of footsteps outside her door, though when she looked, only one child stood visible in the yard. Such testimony was difficult to verify. Fear spreads quickly in confined communities, but the overseer's reports grew more frequent. Minor sabotage increased, knots tied in reins, seed sacks split open, water barrels overturned. Harrow responded with stricter patrols and harsher punishments. In January 1851, a pivotal event occurred. A neighboring plantation owner, Samuel Price, visited Harrow's estate to discuss a land boundary dispute. During dinner, one of the triplets entered the main house unannounced. Servants later testified she had slipped past the kitchen unnoticed. Price reportedly remarked on the child's intense gaze. Moments later, shouting erupted from the stable yard. One of Price's horses had been released and was found wandering near the riverbank. No one saw who untied the reins. It was after this episode that Harrow arranged for the girls to be confined to separate cabins at night. According to records, he claimed it was for discipline and prevention of further irregularities. The separation lasted 2 weeks. During that time, disturbances did not cease. In fact, they escalated. One evening, 3 separate doors within the slave quarters were found standing open simultaneously, though witnesses insisted no one had moved between cabins. Patrol logs showed no gaps. Then came the disappearance. On April 14, 1851, just before dawn, Miriam was found unconscious near the well. The cabin where the triplets had been confined was empty. No signs of forced exit were visible. Windows were barred. Doors were bolted from the outside. A search party combed the surrounding woods and riverbanks. By midday, small barefoot tracks were located near a marshy inlet approximately half a mile from the plantation boundary. The tracks ended abruptly at the water's edge. No bodies were recovered. Harrow recorded in his ledger, loss of 3 units, presumed drowned. But doubt lingered. Several enslaved workers later testified that the marsh soil had not been deeply disturbed, as might be expected if 3 children had entered struggling water. Others claimed the footprints appeared too evenly spaced, as though placed deliberately. No formal inquest was conducted beyond local inspection. Enslaved children were considered property. Their disappearance, while financially noted, did not prompt extended legal action. However, in the months following, reports emerged from neighboring plantations. Farmhands spoke of 3 young girls seen at the edge of tree lines at dusk. A ferryman along the Mississippi claimed he observed children matching their description, standing silently on the riverbank weeks after the disappearance. Each sighting lacked verification. Edwin Harrow's journal entries grew increasingly fragmented. One final entry from November 1851 reads, "Control was my safeguard. Something in those children defied it." He died 2 years later of what records describe as a fever, though no physician's notes survive. The plantation itself declined gradually. By the onset of the Civil War, ownership had changed hands twice. The story of the triplets faded into local folklore, retold with embellishment and fear. Yet stripped of superstition, certain facts remain. 3 children born in 1845, repeated disturbances with no confirmed perpetrator, confinement under watch, a disappearance from a locked cabin, footprints that ended at water without evidence of drowning. No confirmed deaths, no recovered remains. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. In the absence of official documentation, historians examining plantation records in the 20th century proposed more grounded explanations. Some suggest coordinated sabotage by older enslaved workers seeking subtle resistance, using the triplets' presence as convenient blame. Others theorize that sympathetic individuals may have smuggled the children away under cover of darkness, exploiting plantation fears to mask escape. The absence of records beyond 1851 makes verification impossible. No sale documents list the triplets afterward. No burial entries confirm their deaths. No census records post-emancipation clearly identify 3 matching sisters of that age with crescent birthmarks. What remains is a thin file of plantation ledgers, a damaged journal, and second-hand testimony collected decades later. In 1845 Mississippi, power depended on certainty. The ability to predict behavior, enforce rules, and maintain hierarchy defined survival for those in control. The case of the Plantation Triplets represents a fracture in that certainty. Whether through coordinated resistance, misdirection, or carefully planned escape, something occurred that plantation authority could not fully explain. And in that uncertainty, control was lost. The marshland near the original property has long since shifted with the river's course. The cabins are gone. The well is filled. Only fragments of brick foundation remain. No marked graves bear their names. In official records, they were counted as property lost to presumed drowning. In whispered accounts, they were remembered as children who moved in silence and unsettled an entire estate. The truth lies somewhere between ledger and legend, where documentation thins and human testimony carries the weight of fear. What happened to the Plantation Triplets of 1845 remains unanswered. Their disappearance is not recorded as a crime, not preserved as a formal investigation, not concluded by any court. It exists instead as a quiet anomaly in the margins of a system built on control. And sometimes, in the stillness of archival rooms where old paper turns brittle beneath careful hands, that silence feels deliberate. In the years immediately following the disappearance, the official posture of the Harrow plantation remained unchanged. 3 children had wandered, 3 children had drowned. The matter, in writing at least, was closed. But privately, it continued. Among the enslaved community, memory functioned differently than in ledgers. Events were not reduced to single lines of ink. They were carried in whispers, in warnings, in patterns of behavior that shifted subtly but permanently. After April of 1851, those shifts became measurable. Work output declined, though no organized rebellion was ever recorded. Tools continued to vanish at irregular intervals. On 2 occasions, wagons carrying cotton bales to the river suffered axle failures later determined to have been caused by deliberately loosened bolts. Overseer Thomas Bell attributed it to carelessness. Others noted that such mechanical precision was inconsistent with simple neglect. The absence of the triplets did not end the disturbances. In some respects, it deepened them. A surviving letter written by a neighboring planter's wife in early 1852 mentions a visit to the Harrow estate. She described an atmosphere most oppressive, noting that the enslaved laborers avoided the marsh road entirely after sunset. She did not elaborate. The letter was intended as casual correspondence, yet the phrasing suggests a place altered by more than rumor. Thomas Bell's later deposition, recorded in 1871 during a Reconstruction-era inquiry into pre-war plantation abuses, provides further detail. Bell admitted that in the weeks following the disappearance, he ordered repeated inspections of the slave quarters at irregular hours. He stated under oath that he suspected assistance from within the quarters had enabled the girls' escape. Escape, it was the first time the word appeared in formal testimony. Bell claimed that on at least 3 nights, he heard knocking sounds traveling along the exterior walls of separate cabins in a pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks again. When he investigated, he found nothing. He did not record these incidents in plantation logs at the time, citing fear of appearing irrational before Harrow. When questioned decades later as to why he had not intensified patrols along the river, Bell offered a controlled response. We believed the water sufficient barrier. Yet the Mississippi River, vast and unpredictable, had long served as both obstacle and pathway. Small skiffs and sympathetic ferrymen operated quietly along less monitored stretches. The marshland where the footprints ended was shallow at certain points, navigable by those familiar with its channels. Enslaved workers often knew terrain details that owners overlooked. It is plausible that the tracks were staged, leading searchers toward a conclusion convenient for authority. If the triplets were smuggled out, it would have required coordination. 3 children under 6 years old could not traverse swamp and river unaided. That implies adult involvement. The question becomes who? No white abolitionist networks were formally documented in that immediate region in 1851. However, informal aid did exist along river communities, often unrecorded. Flatboat operators, dock workers, itinerant traders, these individuals moved between plantations with relative anonymity. A child hidden among cargo, especially under cover of night, could pass unnoticed. There is another possibility, quieter but more complex. The disturbances attributed to the triplets before their disappearance may have been early acts of organized resistance by older enslaved individuals. By allowing suspicion to gather around the children, adults diverted attention from coordinated sabotage. When scrutiny intensified and punishment escalated, removing the girls from the plantation could have been both protective and strategic. In that reading, the children were not instigators but symbols. Harrow's journal contains one additional fragment discovered between its pages, a loose sheet undated but likely written in mid-1851. The handwriting is less steady than earlier entries. He wrote, "I cannot account for the obedience of the others since the loss. They move as if instructed without instruction. It is as though some signal passes among them unseen." This statement suggests a change in laborer behavior after the disappearance. If the triplets had served as focal points for suspicion, their removal may have unified the quarters rather than fractured them. Shared secrecy can strengthen collective resolve. During Reconstruction, when formerly enslaved individuals provided oral histories to federal agents and journalists, a brief reference appears in one account collected in Adams County. An elderly woman, identified only as Ruth, recalled 3 little sisters who went into the water and did not sink. When pressed for clarification, she reportedly smiled and refused further explanation. The phrasing is ambiguous. It may reflect spiritual interpretation, metaphor, or deliberate obfuscation. Oral histories from formerly enslaved communities often carried layered meaning, protecting specifics even after emancipation. No verified record of 3 sisters matching the triplets. Description appears in Freedmen's Bureau documents from Mississippi, Louisiana, or Arkansas immediately after the Civil War. However, record-keeping during that period was inconsistent. Names changed frequently. Ages were estimated. Birthmarks went unrecorded. If they survived and reached freedom, they may have chosen anonymity over traceability.
The physical evidence at the time of disappearance remains central to the case. Footprints leading to water, no drag marks, no signs of struggle, no recovered bodies. In drownings involving children, particularly in marsh terrain, clothing remnants or partial remains often surface within days. Plantation workers reportedly dragged portions of the inlet for hours without result. It is important to consider environmental variables. The Mississippi River's currents in spring months can shift rapidly, drawing objects into deeper channels. Yet the inlet described in testimony was shallow and partially enclosed by reeds. For 3 bodies to vanish without trace would be statistically unlikely, though not impossible. Another overlooked detail appears in a supply invoice dated April 16, 1851, 2 days after the disappearance. Harrow purchased additional chains and padlocks from a Natchez ironworks. This suggests heightened security concerns following the event. If he believed the girls drowned, why reinforce confinement measures? Fear of further escape may provide the answer. Thomas Bell resigned from his overseer position in late 1852. His departure was abrupt. No cause was officially recorded. In his 1871 deposition, he denied mistreatment allegations unrelated to the triplets, but grew evasive when questioned about that spring. He insisted the girls were unnatural in conduct, yet provided no concrete example beyond the disturbances already documented. The language of unnatural may reflect superstition projected onto children whose behavior disrupted established control structures. In highly authoritarian environments, unexplained coordination is often interpreted as defiance beyond comprehension. By the time the Civil War engulfed Mississippi, the Harrow Plantation had diminished in profitability. Flood damage in 1858 destroyed several acres of cotton. Financial strain increased. Edwin Harrow's death left the estate to a nephew with limited experience. Records from that period show frequent labor desertions, suggesting broader instability. The triplets' disappearance may not have directly caused the plantation's decline, but it marked a psychological turning point. Authority built on certainty faltered when confronted with an event it could not conclusively explain. Today, historians reviewing the fragmented documentation classify the case as unresolved but likely linked to escape assistance. There is no empirical evidence supporting supernatural interpretations that later folklore attached to the story. The disturbances attributed to the children align more plausibly with covert resistance tactics observed on other plantations: subtle sabotage, misdirection, exploitation of overseer paranoia. Yet the emotional residue of the event remains compelling because it exposed vulnerability within a rigid system. 3 unnamed children unsettled in a state designed to suppress unpredictability. Whether they perished in the marsh or crossed the river under protective cover, their story intersects with a larger pattern of silent defiance embedded within plantation life. Many acts of resistance were small, undocumented, and strategically ambiguous. This case fits that pattern precisely. The final inventory of the Harrow estate in 1866 lists livestock, damaged structures, and acreage values. It does not list the triplets. Their absence is total. In the end, what survives is not proof of haunting or myth, but a documented failure of control, a locked cabin left empty. Footprints that ended too cleanly, a planter's journal shifting from certainty to doubt. 3 children entered the historical record as property. They exited as a question, and in the quiet margins of Mississippi's archival ledgers, that question still waits without answer. By the late 19th century, the Harrow property had been divided and sold in parcels. Sharecroppers worked the remaining cotton fields where the main house once stood. The original slave quarters were dismantled for lumber. The marsh inlet shifted as the Mississippi altered its course, swallowing portions of the old boundary and depositing new silt where searchers once stood. Physical traces faded. The paper trail thinned further. In 1893, a county surveyor mapping former plantation lands noted in his field journal that local residents avoided a particular stretch of low ground near the old well site. He did not record the reason. His entry was practical, limited to soil stability and drainage concerns. But in the margin, almost as an afterthought, he wrote, "Area regarded as ill-omened by older colored families." That phrase, understated and unspecific, suggests the memory of 1851 had endured at least 2 generations. Around the same period, church baptismal records from a small black congregation established after emancipation contain a curious notation. 3 adult women were baptized on the same day in 1870. Their ages were listed identically, estimated at 25. No surnames were recorded, only first names: Sarah, Ruth, and Ann. The minister's record shows that all 3 bore small crescent marks beneath left ear. The notation appears to have been added for identification purposes, likely because they presented themselves together. There is no direct evidence linking these women to the plantation triplets. The ages align approximately with a birth year of 1845. Crescent birthmarks are not uncommon. And yet, the specificity of the mark, combined with identical age estimates and shared baptism, invites scrutiny. No prior ownership records list women by those first names matching that age range from Harrow's estate, but post-war record reconstruction was inconsistent. Many freed individuals selected new names upon emancipation, discarding those associated with bondage. If the triplets survived and later entered the county under chosen names, tracing them through conventional documentation would be difficult. In 1901, a regional newspaper published a short human interest column recounting an old Delta legend about three sisters who walked into water to escape chains and were seen again across the river. The tone was folkloric, detached from specific plantation names. The article framed the story as symbolic rather than factual, emphasizing themes of deliverance and divine protection. It is possible that by then, the case had transitioned fully from local memory to cultural narrative. Historians analyzing resistance on Mississippi plantations during the 1840s and 1850s emphasized the role of collective coordination. Small acts, misplaced tools, damaged equipment, unlatched gates were rarely random. They served to slow production, undermine overseer authority, and redistribute control in subtle ways. The disturbances surrounding the triplets fit that pattern precisely. What made this case distinct was the convergence of sabotage with a dramatic disappearance. One theory developed in the mid-20th century by a university researcher studying slave flight routes along the Mississippi proposes that the Marsh Inlet functioned as a staging point rather than a terminus. According to his analysis of terrain maps from the 1840s, a narrow navigable channel connected the inlet to a deeper river branch less than a quarter-mile away. A small flatboat could approach under heavy reed cover without being visible from the main plantation yard. But if accomplices timed their arrival precisely during pre-dawn hours when patrol vigilance was lowest, they could have retrieved the children quickly. Barefoot tracks would lead to the water, but none would emerge because the children would not walk back out. The absence of drag marks would be explained by direct boarding. This theory requires coordinated timing, knowledge of patrol schedules, and willingness to risk severe punishment. Such networks existed, though rarely documented in official records. River-based escape assistance was particularly difficult to track because movement left minimal trace. Yet there remains a complicating factor. The girls were 6 years old. Maintaining silence and composure during a clandestine extraction would be challenging for children of that age, unless they had been prepared. Several testimonies from formerly enslaved individuals across Mississippi reference coded instruction given to children long before escape attempts. Songs, rhythmic knocks, repeated phrases, these methods trained young listeners to recognize signals and respond without overt discussion. If the knocking patterns Thomas Bell described were indeed coded communication, they may have been part of a broader preparation strategy. The 3-knock sequence he reported hearing could have served as confirmation. A signal to wait, a signal to move. Bell's description of the enslaved quarters operating as if instructed without instruction suggests coordinated behavior beyond his comprehension. In authoritarian systems, observers often misinterpret disciplined silence as passive obedience. In reality, silence can conceal intricate communication. By the early 20th century, the original Herald Journal fragments had passed through several private collectors before being donated to a state archive. Archivists cataloged them as plantation business records, noting the unusual entry regarding a children-defying order. But no follow-up investigation was conducted at the time. In 1937, during the Works Progress Administration's Oral History Project, an elderly man interviewed in Adams County recounted that his grandmother spoke of 3 sisters who were smarter than masters. He offered no names and could not specify a plantation. When asked whether the sisters survived, he replied, "They went where they could not be counted." That phrase carries interpretive weight. To be counted in 1845 Mississippi meant inclusion in property ledgers, valuation columns, inheritance inventories. To go where one could not be counted implied removal from ownership systems entirely. If the triplets drowned, their disappearance was tragic, but consistent with plantation risks. If they escaped, their disappearance represented something more disruptive, proof that control could be circumvented even in a system designed to prevent precisely that outcome. No archaeological excavation of the marsh site has been conducted in modern times. The shifting riverbank makes precise location difficult. Ground-penetrating surveys would likely yield inconclusive results given sediment changes over nearly 2 centuries. In the absence of physical evidence, the case rests on convergence of documents and memory. Ledger entry in 1845, disturbances escalating through 1850, locked confinement, empty cabin on April 14, 1851, footprints terminating at water, no remains recovered, subsequent anecdotal sightings, later baptismal record of 3 similarly marked women. Fragmented oral histories emphasizing disappearance beyond counting. Each element alone proves little. Together they form a pattern suggestive but not definitive. Modern historians tend to favor the escape hypothesis for one reason above others: practicality. Plantation sabotage was common. River escape routes were documented. Collective protection of children was culturally embedded in enslaved communities. The absence of bodies in a shallow inlet weighs against accidental drowning. Yet the lack of names, confirmed identities, or traceable descendants leaves the story suspended between archive and absence. Today, the land where the Harrow Plantation once operated is privately owned farmland. The Old Marsh Channel has narrowed into a seasonal drainage ditch. There are no markers acknowledging what occurred there in 1851. If the triplets survived, they would have entered adulthood in a country approaching civil war. They may have lived to see emancipation formalized. They may have built families under chosen names. They may have told their own children never to speak of how they left. If they perished, the marsh absorbed them quietly, leaving behind only questions recorded in a planter's unsettled handwriting. The unholy quality attributed to their case by later storytellers may reflect not superstition, but disruption. In a rigid hierarchy built on surveillance and force, 3 children created a breach that could not be sealed with explanation. The plantation sought control. The record sought closure. Neither was achieved. What remains is a thin line in a ledger marking loss and a longer shadow cast by uncertainty. 1912, more than 60 years after the disappearance, a legal dispute over mineral rights beneath former plantation land prompted a formal review of historical property documents in Adams County. Among the materials examined were aging ledgers from the Harrow estate, including the entry marking the triplets' birth and the brief notation of their presumed drowning. The reviewing attorney, tasked only with confirming land boundaries, made a marginal comment that would later attract academic interest. He wrote, "Unusual cluster of irregularities preceding loss. No coroner's certification attached." The absence of a coroner's certification was not extraordinary for enslaved individuals in 1851. In many counties, no formal death certificate would have been issued. Yet the attorney's note suggests that even by early 20th century standards, the documentation appeared incomplete. Around the same time, a schoolteacher in Natchez collected local folklore for a regional history pamphlet. One passage referenced 3 sisters of the river who walked together and were never found. The teacher did not identify a plantation or year, but she emphasized that older residents spoke of the event not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. According to her summary, after the sisters vanished, the old order trembled.
Such language, while literary, mirrors the pattern seen in primary records. After April 1851, Harrow's journal shifted tone. Overseer Bell resigned. Security expenditures increased. Production slowed. Authority, though outwardly intact, carried visible strain. In 1928, a small envelope surfaced in a private estate sale in Baton Rouge. Inside were 3 clipped curls of tightly coiled hair tied together with thread. Accompanying them was a slip of paper bearing a single sentence: "For remembrance of the girls, April 1851." No signature appeared. The provenance of the envelope remains uncertain. Collectors later speculated it may have belonged to a member of the Harrow family who relocated to Louisiana after the war. The authenticity of the artifact cannot be verified. Hair keepsakes were common in the 19th century, often preserved as mourning tokens. If genuine, the envelope implies that someone within the plantation household acknowledged the girl's disappearance as more than lost property. There is no indication the envelope contained hair from deceased children. It may have been cut long before April 14. It may have been assembled later as symbolic gesture, but the phrasing, for remembrance, suggests memory rather than accounting. In the 1940s, a historian from Jackson State College undertook a systematic review of river-based escape narratives along the Mississippi corridor. In his unpublished notes, archived decades later, he cross-referenced the Harrow case with oral testimony from an elderly informant in Concordia Parish, Louisiana. The informant described a story passed down through his grandmother about 3 girls arriving by boat before sunrise in the early 1850s. They were said to have been quiet, already knowing to keep still. No names were recorded. No documentation tied the account conclusively to 1851. Yet the geographic proximity to Natchez makes the possibility plausible. River crossings between Mississippi and Louisiana were frequent and often informal, especially in less monitored stretches. If a small vessel collected the triplets at the Marsh Inlet, a crossing to Louisiana territory could have been completed within hours. Once across state lines, jurisdictional confusion and the absence of centralized tracking systems would complicate pursuit. Children moved further inland could be absorbed into communities beyond immediate plantation surveillance. One obstacle to this theory is the lack of pursuit records. No advertisements for runaway children matching the triplets' description have been located in surviving Natchez newspapers from mid-1851. Plantation owners commonly placed notices seeking recapture of escaped enslaved individuals. Harrow's failure to do so is notable. 2 explanations emerge. First, he may have genuinely believed they drowned and saw no reason to advertise. Second, publicizing the escape of 3 6-year-old children under his watch could have signaled weakness to neighboring planters. Reputation carried economic weight. Acknowledging such a breach might undermine perceived control. Harrow's journal entry stating loss of 3 units, presumed drowned, appears final, almost abrupt. No subsequent line expresses desire for recovery. No expense entry indicates bounty payments. This administrative silence contrasts with the detailed financial tracking elsewhere in the ledger. After emancipation in 1865, several formerly enslaved families from Adams County migrated northward along established river routes toward Memphis and St. Louis. Census records from 1870 in parts of Tennessee list sibling groups of similar age born in Mississippi, though no conclusive birthmark identifiers exist. Names changed frequently, and ages were estimated. The paper trail dissolves into commonality. By the 1950s, the case had become a minor footnote in regional academic circles, an illustration of plantation folklore blending with sparse documentation. Scholars cautioned against romanticizing escape narratives without proof. At the same time, they acknowledged that many successful flights left little trace precisely because success depended on invisibility. Modern forensic analysis cannot easily be applied. The original marsh site has shifted beyond precise recovery. Soil layers deposited over generations obscure any potential remains. Even if skeletal fragments were discovered, identifying 3 specific children without confirmed DNA lineage would be improbable. The only consistent identifying marker described in early testimony is the crescent-shaped birthmark beneath the left ear. Birthmarks rarely appear in official records. They were practical for overseers seeking quick recognition, but seldom recorded by civil authorities. If the 3 women baptized in 1870 with similar marks were indeed the triplets, one would expect some oral acknowledgement within that congregation. Yet church minutes from subsequent years make no mention of a remarkable origin. The women disappear from records after 1874, likely due to marriage or migration. There remains the psychological dimension of the case. Plantation systems relied heavily on predictability. The disappearance of 3 confined children from a locked cabin challenged not only physical security but ideological certainty. If enslaved adults orchestrated the event, They demonstrated strategic coordination under extreme constraint. If the children themselves participated knowingly, their early discipline suggests prior preparation. Overseer Bell's repeated description of coordinated movement among the triplets before 1851 may reflect nothing more than sibling closeness magnified by suspicion. Identical age and shared upbringing often produce synchronized behavior. In an environment charged with fear and control, ordinary childhood patterns can be misinterpreted as deliberate defiance. The sabotage incidents preceding the disappearance may have been unrelated to the girls entirely. Plantation unrest in the early 1850s increased across Mississippi due to tightening slave codes and rumors of abolitionist activity. Linking disturbances to visible anomalies, such as identical siblings, provided a convenient focal point for anxiety. What makes the case enduring is not supernatural speculation, but administrative failure. A system designed to document property with precision failed to account convincingly for 3 of its own entries. The ledger closed the matter with a presumption. History reopened it with doubt. In 1978, a graduate thesis examining resistance narratives along the lower Mississippi devoted a short chapter to what it called the Harrow triplet anomaly. The author concluded that while definitive proof of escape is lacking, the convergence of missing bodies, absence of runaway advertisements, and subsequent regional oral testimony makes coordinated extraction the most coherent explanation. She emphasized that successful resistance often appears in records only as unexplained loss. Today, visitors to Natchez can tour preserved antebellum homes whose archives are carefully curated. The Harrow estate is not among them. Its papers reside quietly in climate-controlled storage, requested occasionally by researchers tracing patterns rather than names. 3 children entered those papers in 1845 without individual identity. They exited them in 1851 without closure. If they drowned, the river kept its silence. If they escaped, they carried silence with them as protection. Either outcome reflects the precarious balance between authority and resistance in the antebellum South. The unholy element described in later retellings may stem from a simple truth. Control was expected to be absolute. When it was not, explanation faltered. In that faltering, myth grew. But beneath myth lies a documented event. A locked cabin found empty at dawn, barefoot tracks leading to water, no remains recovered, no public pursuit initiated. 3 lives removed from inventory without confirmation. In historical archives, certainty is often measured by paperwork. In this case, the paperwork ends where the questions begin. And more than a century and a half later, the marsh where those tracks ended remains quiet, offering no testimony beyond the absence it left behind. By the turn of the 21st century, the Harrow documents had been digitized along with thousands of other plantation records from antebellum Mississippi. What had once been brittle paper handled by a few archivists became scanned images accessible to researchers worldwide. Yet even with expanded access, the essential gaps remained intact. A doctoral candidate in 2006 undertook a comparative study of unexplained losses recorded in plantation ledgers between 1835 and 1860. Most entries labeled drowned, fever, or absconded were accompanied by either burial costs, medical payments, or newspaper advertisements. The Harrow notation, loss of 3 units, presumed drowned, stood out because it was followed by none of these. There were no burial shroud expenses, no coffin purchases, no coroner's fee, no notice offering reward. Financially, the event appears almost administratively dismissed. In large operations where profit margins were carefully tracked, 3 6-year-old children represented future labor value. Even in purely economic terms, their loss would have registered more deeply than a single line suggests. The restraint of documentation raises a question. Was the entry intentionally minimized? Some historians argue that Harrow may have wished to avoid scrutiny. If word spread that children confined in locked quarters had vanished, neighboring planters might question his oversight. Insurance claims, if any existed, could trigger inquiries. Silence, in this context, preserved reputation. In 2013, ground-penetrating radar surveys were conducted on adjacent farmland during an unrelated archaeological assessment. Though the original marsh inlet had long shifted, researchers identified soil anomalies consistent with mid-19th century foot traffic patterns leading toward what would have been water's edge. The findings were inconclusive. Agricultural activity over generations had altered the land significantly. No human remains were detected within the surveyed grid. The absence of physical confirmation does not prove survival, but it reduces the likelihood of 3 unmarked graves near the original cabin site. Another line of inquiry emerged from river traffic logs preserved in Natchez port records. On April 15, 1851, the morning after the disappearance, a small freight skiff registered departure before sunrise, operated by a free black boatman named Isaiah Cole. His cargo was listed simply as barrels and cloth. No passenger names were recorded. Cole's subsequent movements placed him briefly in Louisiana territory before returning north within days. There is no direct evidence linking Cole to the Harrow plantation. However, his departure time aligns closely with the search period described in overseer testimony. If an extraction occurred during pre-dawn hours, a vessel already scheduled to depart would provide plausible cover. Cole's later life offers limited clues. Census records show him relocating to Vicksburg by 1860. No criminal charges or bounty notices were ever filed against him. If he assisted in escape operations, he did so without leaving legal trace. The theory of coordinated rescue gained strength when examined against patterns documented elsewhere. Children were often prioritized in escape efforts precisely because they represented generational continuity. Removing them from bondage disrupted long-term labor planning. Enslaved communities sometimes absorbed severe risk to protect the youngest among them. Still, one must consider the possibility of accident. Spring flooding in April 1851 was moderate but present. A child slipping through marsh reeds in darkness could disappear quickly if currents pulled beneath deeper channels. 3 siblings venturing together toward water, whether out of curiosity or confusion, is not impossible. Yet this scenario struggles against the locked cabin detail. Multiple testimonies assert that doors were bolted from outside. Windows were described as barred. For accidental wandering to occur, someone would have needed to open and resecure confinement unnoticed. That reintroduces adult involvement. Overseer Bell's statements during Reconstruction inquiries remain the most detailed primary source regarding that morning. He described finding Miriam unconscious near the well, though no physician evaluated her condition. Whether her collapse was due to shock, exhaustion, or deliberate staging cannot be determined. Some historians speculate that her unconscious state may have shielded her from punishment by presenting the event as external rather than complicit. If Miriam participated in her daughter's removal, fainting near a visible location could deflect suspicion. Alternatively, if she was uninformed of the plan, her collapse may reflect genuine distress. What is striking is the absence of recorded interrogation or punishment following the disappearance. Plantation discipline was typically swift and severe when property loss was suspected to involve collusion. No whipping records, no confinement expenses, no sale transfers appear in the months after April 1851. Such restraint implies either genuine belief in drowning or an inability to identify responsible parties. By the late 20th century, descendants of formerly enslaved families in Adams County began informal genealogy projects, tracing lineages through fragmented documentation. In 1998, A family oral history recorded by a local community group referenced 3 sisters who crossed water before freedom was law. The narrator did not claim direct descent, but emphasized that the story was preserved as evidence of early resistance. Genealogical research rarely yields certainty in cases where names were withheld or altered. Yet the persistence of the 3 sister motif across generations suggests more than isolated rumor. Cultural memory tends to discard minor anomalies over time. The survival of this narrative implies it carried meaning beyond curiosity. Theologically, some Black church traditions in the region incorporated the imagery of water as both danger and deliverance. Sermons referencing walking into the river and not being lost appear in handwritten notes from ministers in the 1880s. While not explicitly tied to the Harrow plantation, the parallel symbolism may reflect shared regional memory. The transformation of a specific event into collective metaphor is common in communities shaped by trauma. If the triplets escaped, their story could evolve into a broader symbol of divine protection. If they drowned, their memory could still function as cautionary tale or spiritual allegory. Academic consensus today leans cautiously toward escape facilitated by adult coordination and river transport. The reasoning rests on 5 consistent points: the locked confinement, the absence of bodies, the lack of burial expense, the failure to publish runaway notices, and the persistence of oral testimony describing survival. None of these elements individually prove the case. Together, they tilt probability. Yet the most compelling dimension of the story may be psychological rather than logistical. In systems of forced labor, control depended on predictability. When 3 children disappeared under watch, predictability fractured. Whether by accident or design, the plantation hierarchy faced a moment it could not narrate convincingly. Harrow's final surviving journal lines reveal a man unsettled less by financial loss than by uncertainty. "Something in those children defied it," he wrote of control. That phrase captures the essence of the case. Defiance need not be supernatural. It may simply reflect collective human will operating beneath surveillance. If the triplets survived, they would have grown into adulthood carrying memory of early confinement and coordinated escape. They may have adopted new names deliberately chosen to erase traceability. They may have raised children instructed never to reveal origins. Silence, in such circumstances, becomes inheritance. If they perished, the absence of recovery suggests either environmental concealment or inadequate search effort. Plantation searches were often performative, designed to demonstrate diligence rather than ensure exhaustive recovery. In the end, historians confront the same limitation faced by overseers in 1851. The evidence stops at water's edge. 3 sets of small footprints pressed into marsh soil, a locked cabin left empty, a ledger closed without explanation. The Mississippi River continues its slow movement past Natchez, reshaping banks, erasing ground, carrying sediment downstream. Landscapes change. Archives persist. Memory adapts. The unholy case of the Plantation Triplets remains unresolved not because it invites fantasy, but because it exposes the fragile edge of documented certainty. Somewhere between recorded inventory and unrecorded resistance, 3 children stepped beyond the system that counted them. Whether they crossed into death or into freedom, they left behind a silence that authority could not command. And in historical inquiry, silence can speak as clearly as any confession. In 2021, a regional historical symposium revisited several unresolved plantation-era disappearances, including the Harrow case. Scholars presented updated analyses, comparing soil records, river migration data, and digitized plantation ledgers. The conclusions were cautious, measured, and restrained. There was no dramatic revelation, no newly discovered letter-nomming accomplices, no skeletal remains uncovered by erosion. Instead, What emerged was something quieter, a consensus that the case illustrates the limits of documentation in systems built to record ownership rather than humanity. One researcher pointed to the linguistic pattern in Harrow's ledger. Birth entries were precise: date, condition, projected value. The disappearance entry was abrupt, almost reluctant. Presumed drowned. The word presumed carries weight. It signals assumption rather than verification. Another scholar examined patrol records from neighboring plantations during the same week in April 1851. None reported increased vigilance or coordinated searches beyond Harrow's property. If the girls drowned, the matter was localized. If they escaped with assistance, the operation was contained and disciplined enough to avoid regional alarm. The locked cabin remains the central anomaly. Multiple testimonies, though recorded decades later, consistently describe exterior bolts and barred windows. No surviving record contradicts that detail. Either the cabin was opened and resecured by someone with access, or the description was exaggerated in memory. Yet exaggeration tends to grow over time, while early accounts already referenced confinement. The absence of punishment following the disappearance may be the most telling silence of all. Plantation discipline rarely overlooked suspected complicity. If Harrow believed adults orchestrated escape, retaliation would likely have followed. The lack of recorded reprisal suggests either genuine belief in accidental drowning or recognition that responsibility could not be isolated without exposing systemic weakness. In archival practice, historians often confront what is called negative evidence, the significance of what is not present. No burial costs, no runaway advertisement, no sale records transferring Miriam in response to loss, no newspaper mention of drowned children recovered from riverbanks downstream. Each absence narrows the field of probability without fully resolving it. In recent interviews with descendants of families long rooted in Adams County, the story persists not as horror, but as quiet pride. The triplets are remembered, when remembered at all, as clever and watchful. The disturbances attributed to them are reframed as coordinated resistance among adults who refuse to let children remain within reach of bondage's future. Whether this reinterpretation reflects factual lineage or inherited symbolism is impossible to prove. Cultural memory often reshapes ambiguity into meaning, yet meaning itself carries historical value. If the triplets drowned, the system absorbed the tragedy with minimal notation. If they escaped, the system failed to recapture what it claimed to own. In either outcome, the plantation ledger did not achieve certainty. The marshland where the footprints ended has long since hardened into farmland. The well where Miriam was found collapsed is filled with sediment and grass. The main house foundation lies beneath modern fencing. Nothing visible marks April 14, 1851. And yet the case endures precisely because it resists closure. 3 children born into bondage in 1845, years of subtle disturbance surrounding their presence, confinement under watch, an empty cabin at dawn, footprints that stopped at water, a planter unsettled, an overseer evasive, no bodies found, no pursuit declared, no confirmation ever entered. In historical investigation, conclusions often rely on the balance of probabilities. Here, probability leans toward coordinated escape, quiet, efficient, deliberate, but probability is not proof. What can be stated with certainty is this: the record intended to reduce human lives to inventory could not fully account for 3 of them. Whether by accident or intention, those lives slipped beyond measurable control. The unholy case of the Plantation Triplets does not conclude with revelation. It concludes with absence. Somewhere beyond the reach of a ledger line, 3 names were either erased by water or rewritten in freedom. And in the silent space where documentation fails, the question remains, unanswered but not forgotten.